I'd like to pay my respects to Fred Patterson, actually. That's an honourable life, and it was a life worth lived. And he's somebody that's left an exemplary, legend, not just to his family, but to immediates, to people in the union movement, to the workers, and to Aboriginal rights activists who themselves, I know from my own reading of history, went on to leave a legacy to others to become those Aboriginal activists that fought for their lands and never lost their dream to reclaim what he actually achieved in his life, standing up against the odds that he actually did to a monopoly of views, and were actually entrapped at time. Because I can never go back to what I always go back to a little bit of philosophy that I read, having studied philosophy heavily. People often think freedom is a property they own, and they act as if they own freedom, rather than realising that at best we're all the property of freedom. Whatever. So the eugenics that he would have lived in that time, or whatever, the social engineering, there's incredible resilience about the person to actually stand up and rise. And when the conditions, actually justify it, people do rise with them. The advent of the party itself, there's pending crises that are obviously coming with resource depletion, inevitable. We're in peak oil. Other crises where we've got the replication of an erosion of civil liberties every time that the monopoly of use is actually challenged. And it's no different. We've got the stop and search, the seizure, name and shame, all that sort of stuff, anti-association. They come to the fore when, like Fred Patterson, whenever you try to circumvent the law, whatever, or use the law to your advantage in order to have the right to speak. And we're actually enduring these today. And this is why we actually definitely need a Human Rights Act in this country. But and we've got two. We've actually got one in Victoria and one in the ACT 204 and 206. But we need a federal Human Rights Act, and one that actually captures the ability for people to have a right to their view and not have it challenged at any point in time or eroded. And we've seen what's actually happened in the NT. The Human Rights Act may have allowed for people to actually stand up and challenge appropriately the NT intervention. The NT intervention happened in 206, and it was a military intervention. That word's actually forgotten often, the adjective that goes before the intervention. The military intervention. The military intervention actually happened in the NT when the non-mass discrimination and incarceration and oppression of peoples took place on the premise of a report by Sue Gordon, the Little Children Are Sacred report, which derived a lot of anecdotal evidence that the ABC, Four Corners and other media picked up on, and then basically disseminated to the rest of the world rampant child sexual predation, paedophilia, alcoholism and pornography, being the indicators of domestic violence, rampant once again. Without having tested this evidence, without having tested the evidence-based criteria that actually led to this report, we had an intervention. They just stepped in of the monopoly of use, also passed along by the media. And this is what we actually have problematic in this country. At that time, no political party actually stood up to test it. Yes, the Greens did ask for it to be checked and limited, but no political party actually stood up to say, look, this is a possible erosion of civil liberties. Look, this may not necessarily be true, what's actually going on. Look, we actually need to factualise this. We need the evidence before us. No one stood up. Yes, now we've got some arguing for a rollback. What we need is an overturn of the greatest en masse discrimination that's actually happened in this country. What they did in there to try and evidence and prove and justify the intervention was then en masse medically checked 7,500 children. 7,500 children, of which only 40 were actually referred to various agencies for various reasons, and including children's services. 40 out of 7,500. Then therefore the report's actually discredited. Everybody knows that a lot of these remote communities actually are dry, that there is no alcoholism, and that it isn't as rampant as everybody has made out, and the anecdotal descriptions in the media have actually exacerbated. You don't go into Peppermint Grove en masse, even if you've got 40 out of 7,500, and militarily intervene, which is what actually happened there. Now, I've been challenging Liberal and Labor politicians, and I've gone to a lot of Meet the Candidate forums. Now, I mean, the calibre of these political incumbents and political aspirants is unbelievably low. It's embarrassing, and people should be raising their hand to actually try to actually get into Parliament or to check other parliamentarians in terms of their capacities. But privately, they'll all say, you're correct, Gerry. Now we've got to try and remedy it. What they've got to do is actually have people in the Senate and in the House of Representatives put up their hand and say, no, what's actually gone on is wrong. We can't hide it anymore. We've got to overturn it, and we've got to remedy it. I noticed, you know, in terms of the Fred Patterson, a monopoly of views once again. And a monopoly of views actually happens when you've allowed for a one-party system. I argue that we have a one-party system that's divided into the conservatives and the arch-conservatives. And, you know, we can argue as much as we want that there's a two-party system out there. It's about who does what better, or whatever, right, in doing the same thing. Now, that monopoly of views that actually exists, you know, didn't lead to any investigation of the officer or the reasons for that officer actually inflicting upon that person a criminal action that he did, which almost cost his life, whatever, right, in order to either, you know, disadvantage him or to shut him up completely. That monopoly of views continues today. If we think today is any different to then, we're wrong. You know, I sit like a number of people here on the Deaths in Custody Watch Committee, and I have been for a couple of years. 300 deaths in custody in this country in the last 10 years. 300 deaths in custody, 69 in one year, 59 in another year. In March alone in WA 3. The horrific death of Mr. Ward has captured the public imagination in wanting to address and remedy what actually happened and overhaul the system, because he was baked to death in the back of a van with two compartments actually, two compartments, one air-conditioned and one non-air-conditioned, and yet that isn't in the media often enough to educate people that he was actually put in a non-air-conditioned working part, and yet G4S hasn't been brought to account. Whatever. Out of those 300 deaths in custody, which, believe it or not, if I give you a little piece of evidence to show you how dramatic they actually are in this country, at the peak of apartheid in South Africa, there were less deaths in custody total than all deaths in custody in Australia. Now, there are more white deaths in custody in Australia, but Aboriginal deaths in custody are 12 times higher. And even though they're only 10% of all deaths in custody in Australia, Aboriginal deaths in custody in Australia alone are less than all deaths in custody at the peak of apartheid in South Africa. Something wrong in this country. Yet we've had no one charged. We've had, except for what's happened with Mr. Hurley, Officer Hurley, in relation to Mr. Domergy, and nothing's come of that, or whatever, right, in terms of justice. In this country, we've had no one charged. We've had no justice pursued, just like what happened to Mr. Patterson. And we need to rise. And we need to actually argue the house down in how to go about things or whatever, to change the system. We can't give up. People get apathetic at times, and people do give up, but that's when all hope's lost. And we can't do that. The Commonwealth Constitution of Australia's Federation 110 years ago actually argues that the Senate should be and must be a house of review. Should be and must be a house of review. It's to be demarcated from the House of Representatives. That no political party in this country must control the Senate, as did the Liberals and the Country Party in the 70s, and they squashed and crushed the Whitlam government, whatever, where he couldn't pass a bill under any circumstance. He had, from 1901 to 1972, only 66 bills had been knocked back by the Senate. In his first year and a half, 92 bills had been knocked back by the Senate, and he went to double dissolution. We now have a situation where we're going to see the possibility of control of the Senate by a political party. No political party should have it, even in coalition. It's also wrong for the Greens to be trying to engineer the contriving of political control of the Senate. The 76 senators who are actually elected to scrutiny, to review and to argue the bills in their best interest, not for party rooms and party caucuses to deliver these outcomes. In party rooms and party caucuses, part of the Labor, the Liberal Party, two parties tied to multinationals, to big business, look at their various sources of funding, and those various sources of funding that they actually get that have made them, you know, multi-million dollar political parties, won't be there. Won't be there. At least the Greens don't take that funding from the multinational mining companies, the big business interest groups. So I would actually like to see to reclaim the Senate to have any hope, or whatever, of eroding the two-party system. Because the two-party system subsists because we actually haven't demarcated in the House of Reps and the Senate. Now, obviously the Greens believe in their own personal agenda and that they're going to better things for the right reasons they do. And, you know, the Greens themselves have an identity crisis that they may actually have to, you know, address as they rise and they go along or whatever. The West Australian Greens, I would argue, are more left than the rest of the country, whatever the Greens of the rest of the country. In New South Wales, the Greens now won't march in with the coalition against Stop War. We've seen the disgrace of Tasmania, where they'll jump into bed with anybody, whatever. And in Victoria, they compromise the arts and culture, and in other parts of the country, even Aboriginal rights, land rights, and the environment. Now, as they grow, they've got to actually, to grow, to capture what they may want the voter and become bigger, they've got to broaden their church. And it's argued that the Greens have built 70% of disenfranchised Labourites and 30% of disenfranchised liberal rights. So I would call them the moderates, and I've always argued that they're the moderates or whatever. We've got the moderates, the conservatives and the arch-conservatives. But what we need are more minorities. And it doesn't matter what end of the spectrum they come from. We need more minorities and we need more independents to get into Parliament, to get into the Senate especially, to bring the Senate back to the Commonwealth Constitution, where it's a place that reviews, not from party rooms and party caucuses, en masse decisions, which are actually illegal according to the Commonwealth Constitution, if the Commonwealth Constitution is read, but reviews the bills, the propositions from the House of Reps. That's what I'd like to see happen. But obviously someone like myself would like to see more left-wing bodies actually get independently or as small coalitions supported into the Senate. Because there isn't enough of the left wing in Australia. If you try and think of the progressives in government, who actually are they? We can argue that we need to preference on a merit basis many candidates at the House of Rep level and at the Senate, but it's very difficult to actually find a substantive progressive in this country. And people are actually measured in the terms that Fred Patterson measured his life in the ways they go about rising to challenges and speaking out and not being scared to hide their credentials or their agendas or what they're actually trying to contribute to a debate. I'd like to see, for instance, an alliance between all the socialist parties, and it disappoints me at times when I actually see a lot of left-wing parties scatter themselves or, divide themselves and do it on the premise of political theory. We've also got to be realistic about the paradigm that we're actually working in and not argue that, one's a populist or whatever, right? They've got a populist agenda and the other one's arguing that we've got to be rigorous in our political theory. We've also got to get voices in Parliament. And part of what we're actually trying to do as the Ecological Social Justice Aboriginal Party, well, in 8 months, and I used to be with the Greens, and I'll be on the same page forever with any number of things. While I was sitting with the Greens, I talked to Giz Watson and I talked to others, and I said it'd be great if we actually had a 4th and 5th political influence. We need 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th political influences to break down monopoly politics, to erode monopoly politics at all levels of government. And it'd be great for the Greens and the other parties to try and affirm them moving along, whatever. Right? And at that time, I wanted to help along a target-specific dream by my Aboriginal brothers and sisters to build an Aboriginal party, Marianne Mackay and Glenn Moore. However, it's difficult for them to run as purely an Aboriginal party when 2.5% of the population is only Aboriginal. And if you consider that we bring in 300,000 migrants each year, which only, as everybody knows, 13,750 come in as refugees, and of those, the asylum seekers are included within, and it never goes above the 14,000, and it hasn't in the last 15 years or whatever. Right? So it's about skin. It's about the colour of skin or whatever. Right? We're problematised about the bringing in of peoples, and we don't meet our global obligations as citizens of this one earth. But what we need is to get voices into Parliament. But the Aboriginal Party in itself, even if 100% of all Aboriginal people voted for an Aboriginal Party, they still wouldn't get a parliamentarian in. And a lot of other people would actually preference them highly, but that wouldn't get them in, or whatever. What we need, unless we actually fix positions like in Canada for our Aboriginal brothers and sisters and the Maoris or whatever, right, in New Zealand where they've done incredible things, we need to get their undiluted voices in. So I've expanded it. We've created, and we've grown really fast, a broad party, 8 months, called the Ecological Social Justice Aboriginal Party, and we've extended our hand to the NT and SA and others who are trying to do likewise there. Sam Watson, one of the Socialist Alliance, the other day just sent me a note. Congratulations, looking forward to what you guys achieve. Good luck with the elections on Saturday. This is enormous. This is enormous what's actually happening. We're all on a cultural wave, an unfolding human rights language and an unfolding brotherhood and sisterhood solidarity. That's what needs to happen. I've got the thing, so I'll wrap it up with 1 minute. But in 8 months, we've got 3,300 members. If we were party registered in time, which is the fastest growing political party in the Australian landscape, in Australian history, what we want is an affirmative action. We're endorsing Aboriginal brothers and sisters in seats that they can potentially win. I've gone to the Liberals, the Labourites, the Greens, all of them, and actually asked them to follow likewise, for us to carry their undiluted voices into Parliament. But my dream is to see 4th, 5th and 6th and 7th political influences arise in the next several years. We've got pending crisis coming, and we can actually erode monopoly politics if we believe. Fred Patterson believed. He achieved great things and helped a lot of people along the way, and he's left us a legacy. Thanks for having me here tonight.